Chapter 1: The Arrival. The ultimatum reverberated through the command hub, its weight bearing down like a collapsing star. Admiral Jacobs, a hardened veteran of a dozen stellar skirmishes, felt an unfamiliar unease ripple through him. The transmission was chillingly simple. The Axion Confederation had arrived, claiming dominance over the Sol system in accordance with their sacred doctrine of celestial might. This wasn't merely an invasion. It was a prelude to interstellar humiliation. Earth had a choice: compliance or annihilation. Their terms weren't about simple subjugation. The Axion demand bordered on the absurd. They'd spare Earth if its greatest warrior fought not as a soldier, but as a gladiator within their barbaric intergalactic arena. Jacobs watched images of the Axion vessels fill the tactical feed monstrous, fossilized leviathans that dwarfed humanity's most advanced destroyers. It was a hopeless mismatch, a technological gulf spanning centuries. Yet humanity had never bowed to overwhelming odds. The question hanging in the command hub wasn't if they would resist, but who would carry the impossible burden. Desperation washed over Jacobs as the Axion deadline ticked down. No tactical doctrine, no contingency plan existed for this scenario. Panic seized the world. Yet beneath the rising chaos, Jacobs found a sliver of chilling clarity. Only one human on this entire planet defied every military assessment, every algorithm predicting survival. It wasn't about raw strength, technological advantage, or tactical genius. This was about a will honed by a lifetime of living and fighting in the shadows. There was no soft way to deliver this. "Captain Alexei Dimitrov," Jacobs rasped the name into the secured comlink. "I need you back on active duty." He braced himself for fury, for rejection. Instead, the response arrived flat and heavy like weathered steel. "Admiral, with all due respect, I think you've got the wrong number." "Believe me, Captain, there's no mistake," Jacobs countered, the strain evident in his voice. "Your name doesn't ring any bells on official channels these days for all the right reasons. But desperate times." He let the sentence trail off, a silent acknowledgement of the life Dimitrov had abandoned. A pause crackled like static on the line, Dimitrov wrestling with the ghosts of his past. Finally, a sigh hissed through the comms. "Fine. Where and when, Admiral?" There was no mistaking the weariness in his voice, the quiet acceptance of a duty that should have passed him by. When the transmission ended, Jacobs's unease only doubled. Dimitrov's file read like a fever dream. Deep infiltration specialist, wet work legend from the forgotten border wars, officially listed as retired 10 years ago, location unknown. But Jacobs knew exactly where to find him, the same backwater moon where they buried most of their failed Black Ops experiments. This fight wasn't some galactic spectacle Dimitrov was built for. It was the brutal opposite, a desperate gamble on a broken soldier. The Axion wouldn't so much as register him as a threat. The absurdity of Earth's chosen champion felt darkly poetic. Dimitrov hadn't changed much since those last grainy surveillance feeds, weathered like old granite, a tangle of scars snaking across his olive skin. His eyes hollowed and shadowed with ghosts only he could see. This wasn't a warrior returning to glory, but a man walking from his own makeshift grave straight into hell. But if anyone had a sliver of a chance of turning this suicide mission into an act of defiance, it was him. Chapter 2: The Gladiator. Admiral Jacobs met Dimitrov on the barren surface of the moon. The rugged terrain mirrored the man standing before him, scarred, desolate, yet undeniably resilient. "Admiral," Dimitrov nodded, his voice a rough-hewn rasp. "You sure as hell know how to ruin a man's day." A bitter chuckle rolled from Jacobs. "It gets worse, Captain." He motioned to the tactical feed, the monstrous silhouettes of Axion ships a constant reminder of what they faced. "Earth expects a hero, and all we have left is you." Dimitrov's lips curled in a humorless smirk, but an edge of something hard flickered in his eyes. It wasn't quite hope, maybe something closer to the primal grit of a cornered animal. "No need for the pep talk, Admiral," Dimitrov cut in. I understand my odds. This ain't an arena battle, not in the way those aliens understand it. No rules, no glory, just one brutal question. Can I kill them before they kill me? Jacobs didn't flinch from the stark assessment. That's exactly it, Captain. Let's get this over with, then, Dimitrov grumbled, stepping towards the waiting shuttle. The sooner I do my little space dance, the sooner I can crawl back into that hole you dragged me out of. The journey to the Axion flagship, hanging in orbit like a predatory leviathan, was unnaturally quiet. Jacobs was tense, every instinct screaming against this madness. But looking at Dimitrov, it was a different story. The old soldier seemed oddly at peace. The years of haunted restlessness sloughed away, replaced by a predatory focus Jacobs hadn't seen in ages. The Axion had called for a duel of champions, and in some twisted way, Earth had sent them just that, not a hero, but something primal. A weapon born in the furnace of the forgotten wars, an echo of humanity's will to survive. Chapter 3. The Arena. Aboard the gargantuan Axion command deck, all was spectacle and scorn. Towering reptilian creatures in Baroque armor sneered down at Dimitrov. Axion champions gathered warriors culled from conquered worlds, hardened survivors of countless arenas. This wasn't just a duel, it was a calculated spectacle, the final show of subjugation designed to crush all hope of defiance. Dimitrov was an insect under a magnifying glass, nothing more. A translator squawked a challenge, a demand for submission and acceptance of Earth's defeat. Dimitrov's response was a low, humorless snarl. "I might be Earth's best," he muttered towards the translator, "but I sure as hell ain't here to give a damn about honor." A predatory, disconcerted hush fell over the Axion deck. In their cosmic hubris, they simply couldn't compute a warrior without pride or reverence for ritual. Their mistake. This wasn't a gladiator stepping into the spotlight, but a wild animal loose in the arena. The arena materialized, not some coliseum filled with roaring crowds, but a utilitarian kill zone shimmered into existence via energy fields and hard light projectors. This was an efficient execution. The first opponent teleported across from Dimitrov, a lumbering brute of a Xeno, scaled obsidian armor, plating crackling with barely contained power. The creature bellowed a war cry, the translator garbling the meaning, but the intent was clear. Raw intimidation. Dimitrov didn't so much as twitch. He circled the monstrous Xeno, weathered combat boots barely disturbing the pristine arena floor. The translator whirred again, mocking his caution as cowardice. This, too, was part of the Axion ritual, the psychological dismantling of hope. "Afraid, little mammal?" the creature rasped, a smirk rippling its reptilian jaw. Then, as if a switch had been thrown, Dimitrov moved. The blur of his attack didn't register until the scaled giant staggered, an unnatural wet gurgle emerging from its maw. A thin, crimson line spread across its breastplate, then burst open, spilling viscera onto the gleaming surface. Dimitrov stood beside the collapsing foe, holding what wasn't a blade but a crude shard of metal scavenged off the shuttle during the flight. In the silent awe following the kill, he surveyed the stunned Axion crowd. "Tell your bosses," he uttered into the translator. "Earth doesn't play by your rules." Raw panic replaced the Axion arrogance. Their orchestrated ritual was shattered. One dead champion wouldn't break their galactic empire, but the swift, efficient brutality displayed by an unknown, seemingly harmless insect sent tremors of uncertainty through their ranks. Earth hadn't sent a knight, it had sent an assassin. Chapter 4. The Spectacle. Word of Dimitrov's bloody triumph rippled through Earth's forces faster than any official broadcast. In the bleakness of an unwinnable war, a monstrous defiance sparked a glimmer of possibility not of defeating the Axion, but of bloodying them as they fell. It was a brutal kind of hope, tinged with the desperation of a species with its back against the wall. But it was hope nonetheless, and within the killing field of the arena, something shifted in Dimitrov too. This wasn't a return to glory, but a descent into an older, fiercer instinct and echo of the man he had been, hardened in Earth's forgotten shadows. Not a hero, but the monster humanity needed to survive. The Axion responded not with honor, but with desperate urgency. The next challenger wasn't a brutish champion, but a slithering bio-horror, blades erupting from beneath translucent flesh, poison dripping from iridescent barbs. If the first bout was meant to overwhelm, this was designed to inflict a slow, agonizing demise. But Dimitrov saw only opportunity. Unlike the arrogant behemoth, this monstrous assassin relied on its twisted physiology, and that meant vulnerabilities. His every movement seemed slow, calculated. The dance began not a duel but a hunt. Dimitrov's old scars throbbed in symphony with the alien's dripping poison. This wasn't about strength, but cunning. His scrappy combat style, honed in 100 clandestine brawls on forgotten outposts, became an asset. Every swipe, each lunge of the nightmarish creature left it unbalanced, exposing fragile joints. His own ragged gasps seemed less desperation and more an invitation for overextension. Then the moment came. The alien twisted in an impossible lunge, blades glistening. Instead of dodging, Dimitrov stepped in, weathered hand slamming into a pressure point hidden under the armored carapace. The beast went rigid, nerve clusters overloading, an unnatural squeal of death piercing the silence. He didn't stop, tearing a shard of bio-armor from the corpse, a gruesome trophy, a tool, a message. His breathing still rough, he circled the corpse, facing the now shaken Axion commanders. Lesson 2, he coughed. Never underestimate the desperation of hunted prey. Earth watched in breathless horror. Their hope curdled into something more savage, a desperate echoing of Dimitrov's defiance. In his bloody victories, they saw a twisted victory of their own. If humanity were to go down, it would go down swinging, teeth bared against insurmountable odds. In the Axion command deck, their ritual shattered. A creepy horror was setting in. There was no glory in crushing insects, just mounting uncertainty and the fear of something lurking beneath the calm acceptance of defeat. A species-wide determination that transcended individual life, a primal survival instinct they, with their empires and rituals, had long forgotten. Chapter 5, The Strategy. Dimitrov couldn't keep this pace forever. Each win took its toll. An old shrapnel wound pulsed beneath his ribs, a burn across his back throbbed, reopened in a spray of crimson every time he moved. It didn't help that the Axion were no fools. They switched tactics, isolating him in shifting mazes of force fields, bombarding him with projectiles from afar. It was during the 5th or 6th fight time bled together in the haze of pain that Dimitrov first caught sight of it. A shimmering in the crowd of towering Axion spectators, a figure somehow distinct from the armored ranks, cloaked and hooded, an observer detached from the brutal spectacle. This being emanated intelligence, the cool precision of a true adversary. A surge of old instincts jolted him back into combat. The Axion had thrown some 4-limbed bioweapon his way, fast and erratic, its attacks mere annoyances, painful jabs that wore him down, but lacked any killing blow. It was bait. They knew the real fight wasn't about this duel anymore. Dimitrov's survival now mattered less than his utter exhaustion. In a blur of motion, he feigned weakness, an exaggerated stumble that turned into a lunge. The bioweapon was overconfident, closing in for the kill. Dimitrov used its own momentum, flipping it over his shoulder and shattering its spine against a force field. Silence descended, but Dimitrov's eyes never left the cloaked figure in the stands. They'd underestimated him, and now they were adapting. His respite was over. A wave of his bloodied hand cut the translator's squawk short. "Next," he snarled, voice crackling from exertion. "But don't send anything less than your best. I might be broken down, but the fun's just getting started." His bluff might not work twice, but he had to buy time to figure out his new opponent, the hidden strategist that held the key to Earth's fate as tightly as his own death warrant. The duel had become a desperate chess game, played out across the bloodied sands of the arena. He wasn't fighting for Earth's existence anymore, but for its sliver of hope, the spark of defiance he'd unwillingly ignited. They didn't disappoint. The next challenger wasn't a bestial gladiator, but an armored automaton, humming with contained energy, wielding weaponry the translator struggled to define. This wasn't meant to overwhelm nor to outlast. It was a puzzle, a killing machine specifically designed to counter Dimitrov's chaotic combat style. The cloaked figure's strategy crystallized. They sought not merely to kill him, but to dismantle him, to analyze the reason behind Earth's unexpected tenacity. He was no longer an opponent, but a specimen to be dissected. In the face of this cold efficiency, Dimitrov felt something approaching admiration, mixed with the dread pooling in his gut. He'd faced death countless times, but never with this calculated detachment. Against the hulking champions, he had exploited pride. Against the assassins, their physiological weaknesses. But the machine had neither to exploit just pure lethality programmed into its core. The automaton surged forward, each pulse of its weapon system unleashing blasts Dimitrov barely dodged. They weren't aiming to kill, but to wound. To force him into a reactive fight he couldn't hope to win. The ground around him churned, pockmarked with near misses. Every move he made was predicted, countered. This wasn't warrior against warrior, but soldier against strategist, a war waged not in a ring, but across the circuits of this relentless adversary. He needed a risk, something desperate enough to throw a wrench into the intricate pattern of the automaton's programming. It wasn't his body that would win this, but his broken mind, the fractured instincts forged in decades of clandestine missions. With a ragged scream, more animal than human, he broke the machine's rhythm knot with calculated action, but irrational unpredictability. A charge meant to be a dodge, a wound taken to land a desperate unarmed blow against the reinforced plating. Even as the automaton adjusted, it was thrown off balance for a millisecond just enough. One strike didn't kill the machine, but it disrupted its core. Wires snarled, sparking as the automaton thrashed, half-blinded and off-center. Then the cloaked figure moved, a quick, decisive surge across the arena, hand extended. There was a crackle in the air, then the automaton convulsed and froze, a smoking crater where its chest plate had been. Dimitrov panted, blood and sweat mixing on his battered form. This time, victory had been snatched not by his skill, but by his enemy. The cloaked figure would never let him compromise another one of their creations. It was time to change the rules of the game. Chapter 6, The Escape. Dimitrov knew death was close when the arena shimmered away. One moment he was facing the cloaked adversary, advancing with chilling purpose. The next, he was inside a cell, no longer bathed in the spectacle of combat. The surroundings were starkly illuminated, sterile, and surgical. This wasn't where champions fell, but where enemies of empires were broken. And that, he recognized, was what he'd become. Not an annoyance, but a threat to their very order. No snarling translator awaited him here, no ritualized mocking. He was a problem, not a participant. They came quickly, not Axian soldiers, but the cloaked figure and what could only be described as medical automatons. The figure approached, the hood retracted, finally revealing its scaled but eerily smooth features. "We had hoped to avoid this," the being spoke, its translator buzzing faintly. The sound was less reptilian growl, more of a cool, clinical voice. "Your resilience has proved inconvenient." "A damn shame you won't get your little show," Dimitrov forced a humorless laugh, rattling his bruised ribs. He needed to keep them talking, his body buying time for his desperate mind. "It matters not. Your victories were statistical anomalies, the last gasps of a dying species. But they presented variables," the creature stated, its eyes unblinking orbs surrounded by scales like burnished silver. This changes the calculus, not in your planet's favor. The medical automatons moved closer. This wasn't treatment, he realized, but vivisection. He thrashed against his makeshift restraints, old pain exploding into blinding new agonies. "Keep dreaming, you overgrown lizard," he grasped. But it was more fear than bravado now. This was the unmasked horror of advanced annihilation, slow, clinical, designed to strip every secret from his body and broadcast those horrors back to Earth. A scaled hand hovered inches from his face, fingers twitching subtly, and a sense of unease settled over Dimitrov. The creature paused. Then a strange hiss echoed through the room, something akin to uncertainty. "Your will is aberrant," it said. "It confounds both analysis and prediction." He was running out of time. But in that hesitation, Dimitrov glimpsed the ghost of an idea. It wouldn't save his life, and likely wouldn't even save Earth, but it was his final defiance, the bitter sting of a cornered, dying animal. "Your damn machines can figure out my moves," he choked out with bloody exertion. "But what about something not even I can predict?" A chilling ripple passed through the aliens. The cloaked leader hesitated, an uncharacteristic pause breaking its clinical focus. Then, as the automatons began cutting away at his tattered restraints, it gestured at a shimmering panel across the room. His own reflection morphed and warped, twisting out of recognition as if his image was being fed into some unseen algorithm. His heart sank. Even if he managed to break free, his body was already the blueprint to Earth's demise. They only needed the patterns, the responses, and everything about him was laid bare. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm him, an old memory echoed within his ravaged mind. He wasn't alone, not fully. His body, his every instinct, had one partner he'd almost forgotten, the scars left behind by Project Nightstar. That disastrous Black Ops initiative had nearly killed him, leaving behind neurological anomalies they swore couldn't survive in real-life combat. The glitches, they had called them, sudden lapses in perception, disjunctions between intent and outcome. They'd made him worthless as a soldier, but just maybe, not for this. This final game. "Go ahead," he forced out between hacking coughs. "See for yourself, it ain't pretty." The image on the screen became grotesque, his features dissolving into static bursts. The creature leaned in, an undercurrent of revulsion mixing with calculated fascination. Then it happened. An involuntary jerk turned into a phantom lunge, his image distorting into impossible postures, his vision fractured, strobing as he fought down the dizzying surge of the old Nightstar malfunction. The aliens didn't pull back in fear, but their hesitation deepened. He tasted blood as he forced the glitches deeper, pushing every fragment of his body and mind beyond their natural borders. The image on screen twisted into an abomination, not mirroring reality, but feeding it the chaos of his malfunctioning nervous system. He couldn't fight this, nor control it. He simply was it. A low, tittering sweep through the room, an alarmed chorus from the automatons. With a suddenness that startled both them and him, the glitches stopped. Dimitrov was left drained, sprawled against the restraints, the world bleeding back into coherence. In the room, silence hung heavy. Whatever they'd gleaned from his broken system, it had shocked them. It was their turn to look off balance, their arrogance cracking. Then, with a sharp gesture, the leader turned and fled the chamber, automatons scrambling in its wake. For the first time since his arrival, Dimitrov was utterly alone. He might have bought Earth a moment, or condemned them to something far worse. Chapter 7. The Final Stand. Dimitrov didn't have much time. Adrenaline ebbed, leaving behind an echoing, terrifying exhaustion. There would be no triumphant last stand, no miraculous escape. His end would be swift and sterile when they returned. But in the bought moments of that chilling solitude, something more potent than fear ignited inside him. His life had been defined by duty, by living at the frayed edges of humanity, its unseen wars fought and lost countless times. Now there was no command, no mission, no cause left. Yet the echoes of defiance Earth ignited refused to subside. It wasn't pride or even heroism, rather an ember of the raw, primal spirit his species refused to surrender. This, he finally understood, was the anomaly the Axion couldn't replicate or counter not strength, but the unwavering refusal to die quietly. There was still one move left on the board. When the Axion guards burst in, guns humming with lethal energy, they didn't find a battered prisoner, but a figure standing tall, every ragged breath defying the expectation of submission. They hesitated just long enough. As they surged forward, his weathered palms struck ancient pressure points, not to overpower, but to trigger the final malfunctioning command left behind from Project Nightstar. For the guards, his movements would have been a chaotic blur, impossible to react to before their own nervous systems shorted out in bursts of agonizing electricity. He wasn't fighting, simply triggering the weapon the Axion had left buried within him. In a grotesque ballet, they collapsed, while he was left on his knees, blood trickling from his mouth as the glitches ripped through him. No more fights left, no more games to play. Word of his final moments reached back to Earth through the very command circuits the Axion used to break their enemies. Panic twisted into cold resolve. This wasn't an image of failure, but of the terrifying price of survival. This, they began to realize, was the soul of humanity defiance that transcended logic, hope born out of hopeless sacrifice. And within the heart of the cloaked alien commander, that initial cold certainty shivered. No algorithm could comprehend such an irrational act, yet the seed of doubt bloomed alongside a cold sense of awe. Humans weren't simply a broken equation, they were chaos embodied, a contagion their galactic empire wasn't equipped to understand, let alone conquer. Perhaps Dimitrov had found an impossible victory after all, not with his life, but in the unyielding spirit of his death. This war had shifted. Humans didn't play to win, they fought to not lose, and perhaps that made all the difference. Chapter 8. The Legacy. Far back on Earth, in a bunker so deep even the tremors of orbital bombardments barely registered, Admiral Jacobs received the final transmission. The news spread first as a low buzz of disbelief, then twisting into a strange mixture of grim pride and cold resolve. Humans couldn't outfly, outgun, or outthink the Axion, but perhaps they could outlast them. The war would take centuries, generations bleeding and sacrificing. Their planet might become an uninhabitable husk, but as long as defiance remained, even a cornered rat could inflict mortal wounds upon giants. They began with an act not of attack, but of broadcasting. Images of Dimitrov were transmitted into the cold depths of space again and again, the gladiator against monstrous champions, the bloodied figure facing executioners with scorn, the final impossible act of self-destruction. He became a ghost, haunting the Axion. Not a hero, but the specter of a spirit they lacked. Not a victor, but a reminder of the terrible costs of victory. Each day, the defiant broadcasts would repeat, etching a reminder onto the enemy's consciousness. In the heart of the Axion fleet, the cloaked commander watched the echoes of Dimitrov's brutal existence play out and felt a deep, unsettling chill spread through its armored frame. Conquest was measured in calculated moves, but this was an alien form of warfare. Victory didn't just mean claiming their foe's soil, it meant breaking their spirit. Every orbital strike, every crushing battle, became hollow when met with an eerie chorus of Dimitrov's defiance. Every fallen human seemed to leave a lingering stain upon the supposed victors. It started quietly, an undercurrent that the Axion commanders refused to admit. Hesitations on the battlefield, a lingering dread replacing cold efficiency. Earth wouldn't surrender, couldn't be broken in the ways they understood. Each act of annihilation only further strengthened something that transcended calculation. In time, their victories began to echo like defeats, and the true costs of their war against a small, dying world with nothing left to lose came into horrifying focus. Centuries might pass, the final outcome unwritten, but even if Earth eventually perished and Alexei Dimitrov's name fell into obscurity, his shadow would remain. From that single seed of defiance, from the raw will to defy even death, humans had ignited a new kind of war, a war that might never be won, but might never truly be lost either. They had weaponized an unconquerable force, the soul of a species with its back against the wall.